What's going on, Trollomaniacs? Welcome back to the channel. And at the end of the year, the PS5 and the Xbox Series X are dropping. And the rumor mill's been a-swirling that we're going to have around a $500 price point. And that got me thinking, throughout history, what have the price points been for all of the consoles that have been launched, and how do they compare with today? So I went back, did some research, and I've had consoles from the 70s up until the latest generation, and what the prices were like then, with inflation, what they look like now. So I'm going to take you on a troll to the past as we look at previous console launches and the price points behind them. Stick around, let's take a look. Alright, before we get into it, I want to give you a little heads up. I got my information from Video Game Sales Wiki. That's kind of the place that has all of the console launch prices, and then I went online and found an inflation calculator to find the inflation price. So I think it's all pretty accurate, but just in case you're wondering where this troll made up the numbers from, I did have some reliable resources. So moving on first, the first console that's generally considered the first home console is the 1972 Magnavox Odyssey. Now this console is a little bit archaic by today's standards, but it was mind-blowing when it came out. And it released for slick $99. Doesn't seem like much, but with the inflation calculators, $100 in 72 was equivalent to $611 today. But at the time, it was something that was so revolutionary, and to play games at your house was just crazy on the whole aspect of taking an arcade game home. So for that, maybe it was worth it to you back in the day, but if not, that's what the Magnavox Odyssey looked like. Okay, we're moving up to one that everybody kind of knows, and a lot of houses have this one. This is when video games started becoming a little bit more mainstream, and that's the Atari 2600. I remember my dad having some sort of Atari as a kid. I don't know what he paid for it, I don't know where he got it, but when this launched in the late 70s, it was $199. So on par with kind of what you would pay for maybe a console now, maybe a little bit less. But again, with inflation, we're talking about another $754 today. That's quite a bit for a console, but again, Atari was mind-blowingly better than what Magnavox Odyssey had brought to the table previously. So $750, that is still a lot. Although we spend a lot of money on cell phones. I mean, cell phones are so expensive now, but I guess when you have installment payments and things like that, it makes it a little bit more palatable, a little easier to swallow those Benjamins down as you're forcing them out. But still, $750 seems like a lot for a console. But again, at the time, this was the best hardware that came out, so you kind of got to think about it relating to what it was like in the times. All right, a couple years later, we're moving on to the Intellivision. Now this came out and was priced at $299. So we're talking a couple years after the Atari 2600, the Intellivision came out, $300 price point, and you can imagine what the inflation was like. $943. $1,000 almost for a video game console? Could you imagine being like a 10-year-old kid? Hey dad, can I get a video game for Christmas? Yeah, sure son, how much is it? $1,000. The hell? Yeah, that's how that conversation in my house would have gone. So moving forward a few more years, in the early 80s, now this is when there's a lot of video games hitting the market, so I can't cover all of the games, all of the systems, but there was a lot happening. This is kind of what caused the initial video game crash, was the saturation of video games. Everybody was like, oh, people love video games, let's keep shoving them down their throat. Well, eventually even the hot dog world champion gets sick of eating, and that's what happened with gamers. Okay, they got sick of all these games and these consoles coming out. So a few years later, though, in the 80s, we had the ColecoVision and the Atari 5200, both kind of creating a little bit of a niche for themselves. Atari with the 2600 really made way for the 5200. So with respect to those two consoles, they retail for $200, the ColecoVision, and $269 for the Atari. Why $269? I have no idea. But with inflation, once again, we're talking $475 to $639 today. So again, $475, that seems a little bit more realistic, but $639 back then, it seems like a lot. Now we're moving forward to the big dog, the savior of the video game world, the one who brought us back from the brink of extinction, the Nintendo Entertainment System. the system that I owe my addiction to video games to. Thank you, Nintendo, for creating monsters out of us all. Now, this dropped at $199. That was the original price tag. Now, there were multiple versions of the Nintendo. You could get Rob the Robot, you could get one with different pack-in games. But initially, I believe the very, very first time you could get your hands on an NES was $199. And that roughly translates to $458 today. Not terrible. And with the way Nintendo was, the difference between Nintendo and everything else before it was incredible. And that's a video that I should create for a different day, because if you were not around to experience Nintendo, then you really did miss one of the craziest, most amazing, mind-blowing experiences when it came to home consoles. It was the graphical and the generational jump that you would hope to see. It went from being like kind of a version of what you play at the arcades to pretty good representation of what you play at the arcades with a very small minor downgrade in graphics. The NES was literally as good as everybody said it was, and even holds up today much better than the consoles before it. Now, right after Nintendo launched, there was another company called Sega that came out with their first console. Now, the Sega Master System launched in '86 for $200, so it kept the same price point as Nintendo, so that's roughly $426 by today's standards. So it was a few years after, so the money's a little bit different. And the Master System is really an underrated system. It's one of those that I didn't play until later in life, but I remember my neighbor did have one, and it took me about 15 years to figure out what it actually was, because as a kid I was like, I don't know what that thing is, that thing's garbage, let's play Nintendo. And now I'm going, dang, that was kind of a cool system. So the Master System came out, got a little bit of a market niche, and really kind of solidified itself as a true player in the gaming industry, and had a good price point at the time as well. So even though the Master System was second fiddle to Nintendo in terms of launching, it was a few years behind, they made the decision right afterwards to launch before the Super Nintendo came out. So the Genesis came out before the Super Nintendo, and it launched at $189. Now I always laugh because Nintendo and Sega were locked in a battle. We all know it. Sega does what Nintendo don't. And even then it's funny. It's like, we're gonna go ahead and put ours at $189. Probably knowing what the SNES was going to go for. Even though Genesis came out earlier, they probably heard some insider stuff. So we're going to take $10 off of ours. So $189 roughly translates to $393 today. And the SNES, which did come out a little bit later, was $199. And same thing, it translates to $377, which is funny because with inflation, there was obviously a dip in the market, because $189 was worth $393 today. And a couple years later, $199 is worth $377. So you gotta pay attention. The inflation calculator really does pay attention to what's going on in the market with trends. So money goes up and down, gold and silver translates. That's an economic course. We can talk about that later if you guys need help with that, balancing a checkbook. But anyway, it's funny to see the inflation, that the Genesis was actually cheaper, but with inflation now, it's actually more, if that makes any sense at all. So after the Super Nintendo, we're moving into the Sega Saturn. Now the Sega Saturn was one that really didn't do well. We know the Sega Saturn tried. It's actually a cool little console. It had some really good games, but it just didn't quite get the feelers going that we needed. Now the 3D graphics and stuff were the first big jump for many gamers. That was the first time they really played it in a home console. But here's the deal. It was $399 at launch. That's roughly $695 today, $700 for a console. And we're going to from a Genesis, which was great and did have a lot of really unique titles and some great mascots like Sonic, to the Saturn. But the Saturn just never got the ground. It just never had a chance to make up that ground. And really the Saturn was the beginning of the end for Sega. And then shortly after that, the PS1 came out. That was Sony's first foray after the Nintendo and Sony merger never happened, or the combination of the Nintendo PlayStation. You guys can look that up. So Sony created their own system called the PlayStation 1, and we know what happened from there. But here's the deal. The PS1 launched at $299. So the Saturn's a whopping $100 more, and the PS1 came right in shortly after and said, boom, $100 cheaper, and we're gonna bring a ton of first-party games to the table. And they did. We know what Sony's done since then. So you're looking at the Saturn was $695 now in terms of what inflation was like. The PS1 at $299 would actually be about $506, which kind of lines up with what we're paying at consoles today. So $299 was kind of that price point, I think, when people started expecting to pay that much for games. But Nintendo had a little something to say. They weren't going to come in expensive. The N64 launched at $200, $199. That's $327 today. Now, when the Nintendo 64 launched, it was the biggest launch for me. The NES was the biggest launch for many people that were around when they played the older games in the 70s, but I didn't play the NES until late 80s because I was born in 85, so when I first played Nintendo, it was already out a few years. I was used to those graphics. When the Nintendo 64 launched, that was when I really was like, this is just crazy. It was the first 3D, the commercials blew me away. Mario 64 is one of the greatest platformers ever created. That's right, it is. So the Nintendo 64 launched. I remember getting it a year after launch and I was so excited. So the N64 was kind of the final system in that hardware generation, in that console generation. And then Sega had one last hurrah, one last shot in the dark. They were gonna bring something to the table, the Sega Dreamcast. And you know what? They did. The Dreamcast is freaking awesome. It's epic. It's one of the most underrated systems of all time. If the Genesis is a little bit overrated, I think it's a great system. The Dreamcast is on the opposite spectrum. It's one of the most underrated systems ever made. It was way ahead of its time with the internet connectivity and everything else, and the graphics were great. They really are on par with the PS2 and the GameCube, but it just didn't get the love. So unfortunately, the Dreamcast dropped. But the price point for the Dreamcast was $199, $199, which with inflation is equal to $308. Now what's funny about that is the next console was the PS2 that launched with an extra $100 on top at $299. With inflation was $448, and the PS2 is the greatest selling console of all time and probably my favorite. At least during today's video, PS2 is my favorite. I have a couple, but PS2 is near and dear to my heart. And the PS2 was $100 more, but people didn't care. The Sony PlayStation 1 was so good, the PS2 was hyped. It was the system that finally took my money from Nintendo and gave it to Sony. I was a Nintendo guy. I was a Nintendo 64 is better than the PS1, but the proof was in the pudding, folks. And when the PS2 launched, I was ready to make that jump into adulthood. I wanted to play Grand Theft Auto 3, and the GameCube wasn't going to do that. Not the GameCube's bad, but at the time, I just really wanted that next level. I was a teenager. I wanted to be that teen that had the cool console. I wanted to be edgy, and the PS2 was the one. All right, so moving on, talk about the GameCube. The GameCube was $199, which is roughly $290 by today's standards. So again, price point is great. And if you look at it, after I get through this entire list, the GameCube is actually the best value for a console in history. With inflation, at the price point when it launched, in that year, in that month, in that time period, at launch, the GameCube is the best value ever created in the history of consoles in terms of what you got when you paid that price. Again, it's all debatable. Inflation calculators are kind of funny, but if you look at it by today's standards, at $290, we really haven't had a console that's with inflation be less than $290. So GameCube is actually the best value, which is kind of cool to look at in terms of consoles throughout history. But we had a new player popping in just shortly after the GameCube, the PS2 launched, and that was Microsoft's Xbox. Now, Microsoft's Xbox came in obviously known as a huge company, but not known in the console market. But what they did is they brought a game called Halo that literally solidified them as a true player. And people bought an Xbox to play Halo. If they wouldn't have had Halo, I honestly don't know how well Xbox would have done, but that one game put them on the map and made them a player. And people played Halo and then branched out and played other Xbox games on it. There are so many great Xbox games. My buddy Sean the Nerd Lair does a great only on Xbox series that you have to check out if you're an Xbox fan or you want to know some hidden gems. But when it dropped at $299, which is roughly $436, it was competitive. It was right in line with the PS2, and with Halo, you were going to have a blast. I bought an Xbox just to play Halo. That was it. I bought it, took it to my friend's house. We put 2 CRT TVs back to back. We put 2 Xboxes in there, and we did 4-on-4. And it was one of my favorite memories as a gamer in my entire life, because you can only experience the first time, one time, and that first Halo LAN party was incredible. All right, I'm gonna round out this list with not the current gen PS4, Xbox One. We can find the price on that. Those are easy. Those are still available. So I'm gonna finish with the Wii, the Xbox 360, and the PS3. And not that long ago, but the prices are right in line with what we would pay. The Wii was $249, but let me tell you what, when that thing launched, you couldn't find a Wii. My dad paid an extra $50 or $100 to get a Wii for my brother because it was sold out over that Christmas. So if you wanted a Wii and you were lucky enough to pay $249, that was a great deal because we paid a lot more than that. The Xbox 360 launched at $299 and $399 because they had some with bigger hard drives, some with smaller hard drives, eventually some with no hard drives. So you could get a console for the first time based on the size of the memory, which was kind of interesting. And then the PS3, this one is really what I think hurt the PS3 the most. It launched at $499 and $599. That is expensive. And it wasn't that long ago, but I didn't do the inflation calculator on this, but I can tell you right now, that is kind of asinine. But hey, I paid for it. I bought it day one. I dropped some cash. I was making it rain in that Hastings that day, loaded up on games in an extra controller. Oh man, went home and it was my first time playing an HD console, and that was amazing too. That was so fun playing the PS3 on an old flat screen 720p HDMI television. It looked amazing, and yeah, if you haven't had a chance to experience your first day one console purchase, then you've got to do it once in your life. Go out and buy a PS5, go out and buy a Series X. The first day console launch is always fun, it's always exciting. Sometimes it can be a little disappointing, but most time it's pretty cool. Thanks for hanging out with me today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this troll through the past, looking at console launches throughout history and the prices they were at then with the inflation calculator. Let me know down below if you bought a console on launch and what your experience was like. Also, let me know if any of the prices surprised you. Alright guys, as always, keep trolling, keep rolling. We'll see you next week.